Joe Haldemann is a science fiction author who's been around for quite some while, but you're still going strong. There's still a book coming out regularly, and you're still, true to the science fiction genre. And over the time that you worked here, have you kind of had an eye on the science fiction genre as a whole, becoming a niche, coming back out?
Well, it's not that predictable. So I've written, I believe, 6 or 7 books that weren't science fiction. And I'm a novelist who often does science fiction, but at least a half a dozen of my novels have been more conventional material. Everybody who's a soldier writes a war novel. I mean, right there. And I just kept writing. I don't know how many war novels I've written. Probably more than half a dozen. Probably close to a dozen, because some of my science fiction books are partly war novels. And almost all of my non-genre works have as a protagonist a person who has been a soldier, even if he isn't any longer. So, yeah, I guess, well, it used to be that every American male writer had to write his war novel. But then the generations preceding me, the 2 generations preceding me, every American male went to war. And so they all had this one big thing to write about. But now it's not so true anymore, fortunately, for American males. Yeah, we use money instead of weapons and just crush other countries with high finance. It's much more humane. You know.
Yeah, but not as good as a novel.
No, no, those are really boring novels.
Yeah, maybe John Grisham could make something out of it, but...
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a lot, also in your science fiction novel, your biographical influence, some things that turn up again and again that kind of make who you are and who you are as a writer. Yeah.
Well, usually there's a scientific aspect. I have never actually worked as a scientist beyond the journeyman kind of data collection and reduction, because I never got a PhD in science. After my master's degree, I just sort of wandered off and wrote books. I decided that was too hard to be a scientist. So, I went. I was an undergraduate for as long as I possibly could. I was 6 years as an undergraduate because at that time, as soon as you graduated from college, if you're a male, you got drafted and sent off to war. So I delayed it as long as possible. And basically, it was as if there was a recruiting sergeant waiting as I walked off the stage with my diploma. That was about it. And I was immediately off to a dismal training camp in the middle of Mháire, which is not the best part of America. Oh, I shouldn't say that, but it is true. It's kind of a backward place.
No one from Missouri.
No, probably not. They don't often get over here, you see. And then I went the conventional thing. I had to, with my high IQ and my, exemplary education, I, of course, was sent immediately into combat. I stopped only long enough to wash dishes for a week, and then went into combat and was able to do the things people do. I mean, it was not an especially pleasant experience. It was pretty awful, actually. But that's the soldier's lot. Yeah. I don't know. I got out of the Army with an offer to get back in. I mean, the first thing they do, you go into a big room and they take your insignia and everything. And the last desk you come to is a guy who tries to convince you to go right round and sign up again. And to me, that would be a sure sign of insanity. But evidently some people do, because the prospect of going out into the world and actually getting a job, your first job for most of them, with the only thing you know how to do is kill people, and those jobs do exist in the United States, but you probably don't get them when you get out of the Army. I think you have to grow up in the right family to actually get a job like that. Yeah. I don't know. So I'd been writing since I was a little child, literally since I was 8 or 9 years old. And I started my first novel almost directly after I got out of the Army. I wrote a letter every day to my wife while I was in combat. And basically that formed the nucleus for my first novel, which is called War Year. And it was about a year in Vietnam. And I had, during that novel, everything that could happen to a soldier happened to my protagonist. And pretty grim. It's a funny thing. You can't say why you write a novel usually. There are all kinds of reasons for writing one novel rather than another. But this one, as I say, is kind of a traditional benchmark for a male writer who was a soldier. Or a female writer who was a soldier, I think, also would go to that as the first most obvious thing to write about. I've read a couple of books by women who were soldiers, and kind of interesting. They're rather different, because no woman would, in my culture, no woman would be drafted and sent off to war. But a lot of them went because they had sympathy for the men in their lives and wanted to do the same thing. So.
Okay. With that background, how did you get into the science fiction genre at all? You came back from the war, the first thing that you wrote about was the war. Was it kind of escaping from that, or was it just the interest in scientific things just coming back to the foreground?
Well, the first thing that I published was not a novel. When you get out of the Army, you have 30 days. When you get back from combat, you have 30 days to sort of relax before you have to go back into the Army for the last period. And basically, I had these 3 science fiction stories I had written while I was in college. And I sold one of them right off. I mean, before the 30 days was over, I'd already sold one of them. And then I sold another one. And when I got out of the Army completely, I had started a couple of novels. And I sold one right off, I think. I just wrote up an outline, and I had the advantage of having 2 stories published in magazines, and that is a big advantage, because the editor, when she gets the manuscript in front of her, doesn't have to make the first evaluation. Is this professional work? Because she has at least some prejudice toward thinking that it is professional. And if it's neatly typed and no problems, no huge misspellings, and so it helps. So I was lucky. I sold my first novel right away. Sold my first short story right away. In fact, I sold my first movie to the first person I showed it to. And my whole career has been a series of, lucky first tries. Yeah. I know, and I know enough, I've seen enough early work that I wasn't especially good. I really was there at the right time in every editor's life. And so, thanks, luck. Yeah.
Has it become harder over the time to present something and get it sold and get it made, published, made into a movie?
I've never had trouble. Maybe because I'm serenely confident. And, I haven't had any trouble getting published. I don't get the highest amount of money, but then I don't push for a lot of money, and maybe that makes it easier for, get this guy before his price goes up. Yeah. But, I've never, I didn't go through this struggling writer thing that most people do. And I do believe it's largely luck rather than skill level.
I'm not going to, no one's going to say that but you, I guess. But No, I'm kind of off my track. What was my next question? Right.
You didn't answer why science fiction.
Yeah.
Why science fiction? Oh, that's so simple. It's because that's all I ever read when I was a kid, you know. I never wanted to write anything but science fiction until I got into graduate school, and I had to read a vast amount because it was a degree in writing. And for the first time in my life, I read the classics and read them in enough detail that I could pass exams and write essays about them and so forth. I had sort of a concentrated liberal education, and in 2 years, I read all the books I should have read in the previous 25 years. And there's, you know, I sort of had this massive onslaught of culture. I go, oh my God! And I came out the other end sort of with a guarded reverence for fine writing, understanding that not all good writing or effective writing is fine writing. And I guess I learned the subtle differences or the different kinds of success that a writer can try for and may achieve. I was lucky to have achieved a certain amount of financial success right off the bat. And then I also had a certain amount of literary success, partly because I think I narrowed my own genre down to where there was only one person doing it, and waiting for other people to come up behind me. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe most writers have this feeling that only they could have filled this particular niche, and so you become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I couldn't argue with it. It seems to be true in my case.
So for you, writing is something you've always done that. You, apart from being drafted, you never had to work in another job like that. Yeah, so is it for you just that's my job? That's like a craftsman doing it, or do you see more in it?
It's sort of like a craftsman, in that. Like a craftsman, a writer does have to learn certain rules and certain methods and so forth. You learn to use your tools the way a craftsman does, except the difference is a writer never hurts himself with his tools if he doesn't do it right. I guess I was ready for my apprenticeship before I graduated from college. I mean, I never was in the job market because I was published right away. And I didn't have to say, oh my God, I want to write books, so what will I do for money in the meantime? Which is what most young writers have to deal with. But I sold mine because I'm a genre writer. If you're any good, of course you're going to make money, because that's what it's all about. And so I escaped a lot of the traps that a merely literary or purely literary writer would have. Yeah, academically, I was in the sort of career track for a person to be a serious writer. I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, and in America, that is the most serious place you can go. And but I had already published science fiction, and so I just sort of skipped through there, and all of my teachers are going, wringing their hands and saying, "Oh my God, he's never going to go any place. He's going to stay in science fiction and just be a hack writer for the rest of his life." And well, so they were right. Here I am.
Please, is science fiction automatically just not good literature just because it's science fiction?
At the university where I went, the University of Iowa, that was literally true. The head of the department, the writing department, said basically, "Okay, now you've had your fun. Are you going to settle down? You must settle down now and write something serious." I said, "Sure, I'll do that, Professor," but I never did. I wrote a couple of mainstream novels that were necessary for me to write, and then I went back to science fiction. I have nothing against other genres, and the literary novel is definitely a genre. It's as demanding as science fiction or fantasy, but once you learn the rules, you can do it. And I learned the rules, and then decided to stay with my first love. So. Not hard.
Not out of need, just because out of love, because it's what you started with, what you grew up with.
I might have been a more successful writer if I'd gone away from science fiction, because I had, or have, a pretty solid reputation. I mean, I used to get big reviews in the New York Times Book Review. I've never had a serious novel that wasn't well received. But for one thing, I don't like the rarefied atmosphere. Most of my colleagues in that world are kind of stuck up about it and sort of, they're not my class of people. My class of people is people who work for a living, and, you know, a lot of the people who succeed in literature in America are almost apologetic about it. They say, you know, I'm really an academic, and I write these novels because, after all, it's easy money or something like that. The people I hang around with are genre writers, and they know it's work. It's especially work if you want to have the writing be of the first quality, as well as having the entertainment adequate. And yeah, I wouldn't do anything else. I don't think. I mean, nobody's beating down the doors to get me to come to differential equations for them. You know, so I don't know. But that was my training. I was, you know, I could do all kinds of interesting mathematical things, and I can operate scientific instruments. My first job offer was to run an observatory, an astronomical observatory down in South America, in the tip of Chile. The southern skies needed to be mapped with a certain set of instruments. And that would have been my job for about, 3 years?
It was 3 years.
But I got drafted. And by the time when I got back from Vietnam, that job was no longer open. And, well, I don't know. I had sold a story, so why should I work for a living? You know, basically. And that seems to have been a good strategy. Yeah.
When you're a genre writer, especially when you've got your own niche, your own style in a genre, I always wonder, how do you come up with something actually new, and where do you get your inspiration from? Do you read a lot of stuff outside the genre, or where else does it come from, or is it just from yourself?
Well, that's the thing. I sort of stopped reading science fiction when I started writing it, and I tried to be very careful about influences from within the genre, because your readers see that and say, oh, here we go again. And you don't want that sort of a reaction. You want to keep slipping new things to your readers. And for me, what seemed obvious was I should study modern American literature and contemporary American literature, which I didn't see my other science fiction writers doing with any kind of consistency or enthusiasm. So I just did what seemed natural to me, but I put a science fictional twist on it. And then from the other side, I'm doing science fiction, but I'm putting a modern literature twist on it. It seems to have worked. I didn't sit down and map out a strategy. Who does as a writer? You know, I just was writing the things I'd want to read, you know, with the proviso that they should be saleable as well as pleasant to read. So.
Tell what you're reading these days, magazines and things.
Pardon me?
Tell what you're reading these days, magazines and...
Well, I read a lot of journals of science and engineering. That seems to be the most useful source of material for me. And I also enjoy it. I mean, I think in some other life I am a scientist, and I'm working like a good, you know, drudge. At one time we calculated, this is before the web, we had subscriptions to 75 magazines. And, you know, they just piled up in the living room, and I'd read frantically. from all of these. And I think a science fiction writer especially has a hunger for the esoteric, and you want to feed your readers things that will fascinate them. And to do that, of course, you have to find them out and then shape them into part of the story that you're writing. But that's part of the challenge and part of the fun of being a science fiction writer.
Keep up with what people are finding out about the universe,
right,
and wrapping that up interestingly to present it.
Exactly. And you know, what you have is your profession that feeds your hobbies, and your profession can click around the clock and feed the other part of your hobby. And there's never a dull moment.
Many science fiction writers or producers also say or think that science fiction is a great vehicle to talk about things that are maybe too hot politically, or in another way to talk about it in a more grounded novel or something like that. But you can just transfer it. Do you see it like that too? Can you name one inspiration where you actually did that?
Well, I know the model. Okay. The model for me is the Strugatsky brothers in Russia, who were probably in the middle third of the 20th century. They were science fiction in Russia. And the driver for their science fiction was the tension between what they saw as the very defensible and very right political philosophy of the Soviet Union and the misery around them that it produced. And this is not physical misery. This is just going, somebody's watching me whenever I want to do something. And we met them and talked to them at a time when there was détente between the Soviet Union and the United States, 1983. And that was fun. That was an interesting experience, because in America there are political pressures too, but they're much more subtle. And they're usually reflected by the low rate of pay that you get if you're Nicole Torney, if your political philosophy is too far out of tune with the mainstream. I never had a problem with that, because writing science fiction, that's really not much of a problem in the United States or Europe or Great Britain. We can write whatever we want. And if it's not written well, it doesn't get published. Or I shouldn't say that, because some of it is written very badly. But it has to be written badly the right way. And that in itself is a skill that I've never pursued, but I see it happening. Yeah.
I see a lot of people nodding and smiling. Of course, you have your own questions. Anyone?
Talk about your process and show you.
Oh, yeah, I brought some visual aids. Yeah. This is how my books start, with a book. All blank pages, of course, because you have to fill them. But this is the second book in the series that I'm writing now. I'm up to page 111 or 12. But these are, it's just a book. It's just that the marks in it were made by a fountain pen instead of movable type. And what I didn't bring is I have another. No, I did. Here it is. I have a notebook that has drawings and notes and equations, pictures of people and pictures of a graveyard. And I don't know. Sometimes if I'm at the computer, I write something out. I'm not going to sit there and write it out in longhand, so I just print it out and paste it in here. But this is a totally unguided kind of this and that. Like there are figure studies in here because I went off to my Saturday open studio and I didn't bring my notebook, so I had to put naked people in there.
How awful.
Oh, yeah. And this was just, I was in Colorado visiting relatives, and they wanted to go whitewater rafting. And I thought, I want to die some other way. So I sat by the water while they tried to kill themselves. Basically, they had a bad accident. And I just painted the scenery there. There aren't. I usually, I don't. This is not an artist's notebook. This is just notes for this and that. But sometimes I don't have my, my art notebook. And
talk about your process with the other book, huh?
no, yeah. Well, every day I write some, and unless I'm traveling, often to some distant place, and basically, yeah, I proceed in a linear fashion. There are some writers who go all over the map and then put it all together finally when they want to have a rough draft. But really, I just write a rough draft. I very rarely go out of order. And about once a week, I sit down and type it into the computer. And
But the first step is all written by hand, or
yeah,
maybe 90% hand, some...
Yeah. See, I change my pen every day. And so this shows how much I've written that day. And then the next day it's a different color. Every now and then I forget to change my pen, so it seems, oh, he really worked a lot that day. But no.
Show the outline.
Oh, the outline, yeah. And this one, it's in the back.
This book is called Phobos Means Fear.
Phobos means fear, and don't you forget it. Let's see.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, I have, this is the basic outline here. And wait, now, doesn't this one fold out? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, no, this one just stuck together by itself. Well, there's nothing in there. Yeah, this is the main character. This is a photocopy of a purple sheet of paper, and so it's kind of odd. This was a carefully worked out plot for the middle third of the novel, which I've more or less discarded, but I keep it around as a sort of precious souvenir.
Almost everything on these 2 pages is fossil planning.
Yes, fossil. This is fossil planning. But in case I want to use it again, I kept it there. Obviously, these pages progress backward. So I'll be writing on these 2 next. Oh, in fact, I have them. Did I? I have them someplace. I'd probably set them out on a table.
Yeah, I don't think you got them there.
No. Oh, there they are.
There they are.
There. Yeah. I'll be making another little accordion page out of this. But I've only just started. And it's already going backwards. The arrow leads up there.
So kind of every book that you have written has kind of a documentation automatically, how it progressed from the first draft.
From the past 20 or so books, I can say with some assurance, are like that. The past half dozen or so are like this. They've been written out in blank volumes of bound paper. Because I want to do it that way. I'm writing a book, you see, and I can prove it. Because here's a book that I just wrote. But I sit in a coffee house. I live in a small, well, not too small, medium-sized academic town in Florida. And I bicycle to a place, and basically I have found the perfect place for the time being, because it's really only a 15-minute bicycle ride from home, and even at that I have to make a big loop to get some exercise. But it's got Italian machines to make coffee and all kinds of coffee beans from all over the world. And they've got a beer cooler that's full of imported beer from everywhere. And they have good French wines, too. And so, I go over. I work early in the morning from about 5:30 or so, and then of course nothing's open, but about 8 o'clock when the bar and the coffee place opens, I go down there, and I work for a few more hours there. The first thing I do is look at the correspondence and make sure that the world is still there. And I answer a little correspondence, and I go off to the bar and write for a few hours. And then I come home and I type the stuff into the computer. And by then, it's about lunchtime. And I have lunch, and then I go off and have a life. Just do something. I try not to work. I try not to work on the novel afternoon. I feel I'm sharpest early in the day. And so when I'm not so sharp, I'm not damaging the novel by going, ooh, we don't need that character. Make this simple. Yeah.
Okay. Any questions?
I have a question, a very general question maybe. As a writer, what, in your opinion, is like the most important thing to a story? Is it the characters or the ending? Or what would you say is like most important?
For me, it's always the characters. Yeah, the plot's just a framework. And plots are easy. You just keep people in trouble, fuck with them until the story has to change. They're trying to get out of trouble. And ultimately, you start to form an arc that comes out of the characters in the story. And usually certainly by halfway, you see where it's going, and you extend the arc according to dramatic feelings that everybody has. You want the story to be meaningful, but you want it to be a page turner. So you arrange the events in the novel for suspense, but you arrange the characters for something more interesting. Deeper, you might say, but I'm not sure. Almost everything you say about it sounds self-congratulatory, which I don't want to do. Basically, I try to keep it going in interesting directions, so I'm not bored by it. If the author isn't interested in the story, how can it be interesting to other people? Oh, but people do it. I have read manuscripts, especially from other writers, where it's beautifully written and nothing happens. Or it's beautifully written and random things happen. Because this is sort of an outgrowth of the late 20th, early 21st century tradition in American fiction. If you tried to learn writing by reading Esquire magazine, it's probably the highest paying artistic or literary venue in the United States, you would wonder whatever happened to the idea that a story should have an ending. Because really, it's a sign of professionalism that you don't do that. Well, okay. But other people don't read those stories very much. Yeah.
I have a question. Do you ever experience a situation where you get stuck with a character that you're thinking about and just experience that? You love him and you know who he is and you're stuck.
Yeah, that happens.
What do you do then?
Well, this is so obvious. It's so obvious I hate to even verbalize it, especially to writing students. They say, look, what is the most obvious thing to do? You step out of the story completely and write about the character. He doesn't have to make sense in the story terms, but write about him as a sort of dynamic variable within the universe of your story. And you go, why? I actually, this is so... I read an article in a writing magazine by this woman who writes nurse novels and novels for young women in trouble. And she said, well, I never had any problem with the plots of my stories, because if I start to have a problem with the story, I ask the main character, what's wrong with you, dear? What's wrong with you that you don't want to cooperate with me? I mean, you are my friend, aren't you? I'm going, oh my God, does she actually do this? And subsequently in the article, I come to think she does, and she's quite mad. She thinks those people actually exist. But, there's a kernel of truth in there. And I can step outside of my text. And I say, there's something here that's not convincing. And the character doesn't exist, but the things that made the character appear on the page are quite real. And what is it about my understanding about human nature, about the nature of the world, that has turned this into a false statement? And if you look at it that way, which is, in a sense, doing what that lady does, just interrogating your characters and trying to understand the situation, for her, I would say, hey, anything that works is great. And so for her, that's fine. I would feel so self-conscious I couldn't do it. But I can analyze my character's motivations, and I can say, the reason the story stopped is they're doing something that shouldn't be possible, that really isn't believable. And so I usually only have to go back a page or two and change some statement or some underlying principle that I've stumbled into. Because I'm sitting in my coffee house writing, and after a few hours, I might be thinking about lunch, instead of about my characters. And go, why did he pick up a sandwich there? Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions? Okay. They're probably going to pop up and have questions when we've stopped. But thank you very much for taking the time.
Glad to.
Okay.
It's my pleasure.